It's really wonderful to see all of you. This is a very complicated weekend, but we know you all can handle this. I'm just going to try to summarize today in 3 minutes, so you are somewhat aware of everything going on, okay? You will have the first panel curated by Mick Yates with 3 speakers. Then at 2:40, you break up into what we call white cubes, and you'll hear more about it later, or social spaces, or coffee break. Take your pick. Then we have one more talk and the wrap-up, and all of you have to be downstairs in the basement at 6:30 to cross the street in a tunnel, because the boat will not wait. It'll leave at 7, so whoever's behind won't get to go. And tonight's going to be very cold. Please be warmly dressed. Okay, several other housekeeping since comes to mind. There will be bulletin boards outside for all of you who have things that you want to tell other people. Please check, please put it up, because some of us don't know where anybody is. So any change in program will be put on the bulletin boards. Okay? So please enjoy the rest of the day. You have a lot to go through. I'm very sorry, I forgot to introduce Michael,
Thank you.
the Chief Content Officer. Please welcome Mick. He will explain the day, the theme, and the block. Thank you.
Yeah. It's hard after an introduction like that to feel particularly special. We rehearsed that, believe it or not, every piece of it. So I'm not going to speak for very long this time. I'm going to introduce some of the ideas behind the conference. Some of you will have been to these events before, I know. Some are the first time here. What we've tried to do is do actually what P&G people do best, which is steal stuff and reapply it. And we've looked at some ideas from the TED conference. We've also looked outside of P&G Alumni. We've actually got more speakers from outside than we've had before. And we had curators for the 3 sessions: choosing, connecting, and communicating. And each one of those will be explained in turn. The idea was to have a wonderful world, but a wonderful world of new ideas. And we hope that everybody comes away with 1 or 2 new ideas. The brief to the speakers has been simple. First of all, stick to the time. Then come up with something that's going to challenge the audience. Hopefully, maybe they haven't heard before, something that's going to get some questions going. So the speakers will make their speech, hopefully get you interested in what's going on, and then at the end of the session, we'll come back and have a panel for discussions and questions. We hope it's different. We hope it's not just another get-together of friends, which is what always happens here, but we hope it's something that challenges and puts new ideas in place. So I'm going to start by asking somebody to turn off their phone. Thank you. I'm going to start by introducing Chris Meyer. Now, Chris is an old colleague of mine. I first met him when he was running what was called the Center for Business Innovation in Boston. And he was responsible for bringing new ideas into Capgemini, but he also ran workshops on innovation with lots of different companies. Together, we also spent some time at the Center for Institute on complexity science. That was his background. At that time, he wrote a book called Blur, which I think quite a few of you might have heard of. It was a bestseller at the time. And last year, he wrote another one called Standing on the Sun, which was in the Financial Times Top Business Books of the Year. He founded Monitor Talent, that company that now is no more. It's folded into Deloitte's, I guess, and runs his own consultancy called Nerve. Chris is going to talk about the demise of capitalism. So all of the P&G people that came in this room thinking that capitalism was alive and well, Chris is going to tell you it's dead and buried. Chris.
Thanks. Well, given that misrepresentation of my content, I think you're going to be Mike from now on. Before we get going, anybody here responsible, it's backwards, for the magic eraser? If you are, thank you. We love the magic eraser. We washed our children with the magic eraser. We love it. What I am going to talk about is not the demise of capitalism, but its evolution. Here's Klaus Schwab speaking a few Alps over, saying capitalism in its current form no longer fits the world around us. This is 12. By last year, with the financial institutions in better shape, they forgot about that. But in 2012, they were worried about the shape of capitalism, and the economist Ian Bremmer wrote, "Folks at Davos are calling it the Great Transformation. It's a search for new models." So I'm going to talk about what those new models could look like and how we're going to evolve in those directions. So here's another old guy. People recognize Charles Darwin and his finches. People know the story of Darwin's finches? Not so much. Okay, one of the things he wrote about while studying the Galapagos Islands and coming up with his ideas about evolution was that the finch population would move from one part of the islands to the next, and when they did so, the shape of their beaks would change. And he observed that the reason for that was they were feeding in parts of the island with different kinds of flowers. So they needed new tools with which to make a living. And so in only a couple of generations, the tools, their beaks, changed shape. And the big idea behind this book is that capitalism is not formed by people at Davos pronouncing what it should be, but by individuals, companies, and people making choices that change the facts on the ground and the way capitalism works. So this happened when the finches moved from one part of the island to another. What has changed in capitalism's environment? I'm sure all of you are well familiar with the shift in the source of growth in GDP, in world product, I should say, from the G7 countries to the emerging economies. And just to put a number on it, in 2009, $1.7 trillion of world growth came from the emerging 15 economies. These are the BRICS plus what Goldman calls the next 11. And only 240 million from the G7 economies. It's only 1 year's data, but you've, I'm sure, all been immersed in the idea that the new markets are in the emerging economies. And why is that environment new? Because we are moving from customers and societies that are aging, high income, and slow growth to societies that are youthful, low income, and rapid growth. And I just want to direct you to that connected line on this chart. These societies, which are dominated by their youth, 26% of the emerging 15 populations are under the age of 15, but they are just as connected as people in the rich economies. Not quite as connected, only 76 cell phones per 100 people. By now it's probably 86. But it's a different kind of society, poor, connected, growing, young. So there's a lot more on that in the book, but we don't have time for what those societies are like and how their moral and legal systems differ. But the question that the research that underlay this book was trying to answer is, if capitalism is an adaptive system, like the finches, like the species is an adaptive system, and capitalists are moving to a new environment, what rules of capitalism as we know it, the one that Klaus Schwab says doesn't fit the environment, are going to change? Now, we have about 20 minutes. Mick asked me to do justice to a 100,000-word book. So rather than speak at 5,000 words a minute, I'm going to reduce it to 5 of the rules. And think of rules, the rules of doing business, as like elements of the finch's genome. They get selected for, they get selected against, and the shape of the finch's beak changes as a result. So the shape of business is going to change. So these 5 rules actually boil down to 3 observations, and I'll take you through all 3. But the first 2 rules are about what we measure and whether return on equity really is a sufficient way to think about the success of our companies and whether GDP growth is a sufficient way to think about prosperity, and what companies are going to do to change how they measure value. The second thought, rules 3 and 4, are about the role of competition in allocating resources in an economy. So 2 of the most fundamental things about capitalism, profit and competition, what you really learn about at business school, are going to be shifting. And as they do, we're going to create this new sector of the economy, which we call the 4th sector. Not business, not government, not NGOs, but a 4th sector, and I'll explain what that looks like as well. So, first, what do we measure? In the 1980s, we did a few things, particularly strongly in the United States, that focused people on finance and stock prices. We got rid of defined benefit pensions and substituted 401ks based on investment. We created economic value analysis, which said every choice a manager makes in a business has to be analyzed for its effect on one stakeholder in particular, the shareholder. And we started compensating leaders with stock options. All of those focused us on financial performance for shareholders. And that shaped the society, even though it is not the whole society. And it's kind of like seeing the world in black and white. At the same time, the King of Bhutan, 1983, starts talking about gross national happiness. And that Bhutan didn't want to maximize GDP, they wanted to maximize GNH. And the world kind of chuckled, right? Oh, isn't Bhutan cute? Gross national happiness. But what's happened since is that now 41 countries are studying happiness. And I point you to prosperity.com, a website created by the Legatum Institute in London. And Legatum has been studying what it is that makes people feel prosperous very rigorously. And they've come up with an index. It's based on these 8 dimensions, not just economy, but opportunity, governance, education, health. You can read them around the figure. And about 80 different variables drive these 8 in turn. So, not going to go deeply into this, but it's interesting to observe. I just picked, and the website allows you to look at whatever countries you want and compare them however you want. The US and China and Norway are remarkably close in their economic performance, but where they differ is on issues like personal freedom, health, safety, and security. And what's happened to capitalism, the kind that doesn't fit anymore, is that it has focused our attention, our lawmaking, our politics only on that economy dimension. Perhaps this is a little less true in Europe, but not that much less. Now, what's happening in the corporate sector in response is that companies are beginning to embrace the idea that those other dimensions matter. I don't know if externalities is a familiar term to people. Yes? No? Not so much? Externalities is an economics term of art. That means those things for which that a company causes, but for which it is not accountable. And pollution is the textbook example. If there is a cost to a farmer downstream whose crops are being spoiled by the acid rain, companies don't have to pay for emitting the pollutants that cause it. That's an externality for which they bear no cost. But what's started to happen is that companies are starting to respond not necessarily to the law, but to other political forces and to consumers in owning their externalities. So P&G is a good example. The example I was told about was the recycling industry in the Philippines. So in service of your goal to eliminate P&G packaging from the consumer waste cycle, you found that the Philippines had no recycling industry, and you put two companies from other countries together and said, hey, the Philippines are an opportunity. Why don't you go form a company and do business there? And took no interest in it. And in the book, we call this taking ownership of the problem. What does that mean? It means you both have direct causality. It's easy to see whose packaging it is. So it's not you are responsible for that piece of a problem. And you have the capacity, the capability to do something about it. Now, a next reduced level of responsibility that companies can take is to take action rather than ownership. So there was a Coke bottling plant in India that was reducing the water table locally by the amount of water it took out of it. Now, they don't control the water table. They don't regulate water consumption, and of course there are other constituents like the farmers whose behavior affects this. So what Coke did in that instance was to form a group that took responsibility collectively for managing water use in the area. So they took action, they organized this, and they contributed to it. And then a third level of responsibility is to take an interest. So Shell Foundation has been charged with helping people everywhere have access to clean energy. So Shell doesn't make cooking stoves, and they don't make cooking fuel, but they found in Pakistan and India, etc., people are using stoves that are very unhealthy and dangerous. And so the foundation supports NGOs that distribute a better model of cooking stove. So take ownership, take action, take an interest are ways of companies extending their responsibility for the externalities that they cause. And one last interesting example is Microsoft. So you probably are aware that power consumption, energy consumption, has become an issue in the high-tech industry. Microsoft has embedded in its core business today a carbon tax. So if you run a P&L, that P&L includes an assessment for the amount of carbon that you emit. So it is as if there were a governmentally imposed tax on carbon emission that drives your behavior as a Microsoft manager, even though it's a phantom tax. Which I think is a very subtle and powerful way to go about it. So I talked about rules changing in capitalism. Milton Friedman, University of Chicago economist, said in the 1980s, there's only one social responsibility of business, to use its resources to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the law. Well, that could be the rule. And that has been the behavior in general of business historically. Peter Drucker, though, suggests a different rule. There is no doubt regarding management's responsibility for the social impacts of its organization. So Mick called this unit making choices. We as a society can make a choice between those two rules. You know, do we want finches with this shaped beak or that shaped beak? Here's a choice. And it's one that we can see the corporate sector making increasingly on Drucker's side. So point one, the overall idea is we are starting to measure externalities. We have the ability to, we have the will to, and people are giving the corporate sector feedback about them, and corporations are responding. Second point, let's move on to competition. Anybody see the movie Duplicity? You people don't have hands, do you? That's better. All right. So Duplicity, Julia Roberts, Clive Owen as corporate espionage enemies. And the movie begins with this great scene of two Gulf Streams parking nose to nose on a rainy tarmac. And Tom Wilkinson and Bart Giamatti approaching each other like a gunfight and getting into this titanic struggle, which ends up with them rolling around on the ground, ruining two very expensive Brioni suits. And this is a symbol of corporate competition. And that's what the movie is really about. So let's recast the movie. Let's make these AT&T and Verizon in their titanic struggle, presumably for market share. Now, if we look at these companies in 2009 and what they spent on advertising, you get a total of nearly $7 billion. How much market share do you think changed hands? Anybody think 5%? I see a 0. It was about a 0.5%, right? And the next year, probably 0.5% the other way. So what kind of a resource allocation is this for a capitalist economy? I'm sorry, Sachi. But let's look at a competitor from one of these emerging economies, Airtel, India's largest provider of cell phone services, right? How much capital do they invest per customer? 1/10 what Verizon invests. What kind of growth are they supporting? 30 times Verizon's growth. Most important, they're making money supporting customers who spend $15 a year on their mobile services, while Verizon and AT&T are spending $35 per customer per year just on advertising. And you have to ask, is this value creation? Is this competition? Certainly not. And so we coined this term pseudo competition to describe the way in a mature economy oligopolies compete on this share of voice without anything really changing and without innovation. At a time when Airtel is innovating in a variety of ways, most importantly business model, by sharing towers, sharing development expenses, and competing only on their ability to get the service to customers in this rapidly growing market. So this leads us to the how. If we're not going to pseudo-compete, what are we going to do instead? We're going to innovate. We're going to make magic erasers and other things that the world hasn't seen before. And if you're competing on innovation, how do you do it? Well, P&G is a pioneer with Kinect and Develop, right? A move toward open innovation. Now, it's not as open, though, as Linux and Wikipedia and Google were open in crowdsourcing their ideas and their content, but in a way that was not by contract, as Kinect and Develop or Innocentive are, but without any visible relationship between what would be buyer and seller, but what are in fact producer and distributor. So you wrote a line of Linux code, you produced something for your own use, you shared it with all the other users, and the Linux ecosystem distributed it for you. So how do you make money doing that, right? That's what everybody wants to know. Well, we know from Google there's one way to do it. But let's look at a way that isn't ad supported. How many of you bought one of these, the Microsoft Kinect? More hands, all right. Games we can get you to cop to. So the Microsoft Kinect came out, and for those of you who don't know, this is a device you hook onto your Xbox game console, and it sees you, and it listens to you. You don't have to hold a controller. If you make a tennis swing, it sees your tennis swing. When this came out, a hacker from the Maker movement, who's known as Lady Ada, but her name is Limor Fried, posted on the web a $1,000 reward for anyone who would put a driver online that would take the information observed by the Xbox and make it available to apps that you write yourself. So what do you think Microsoft did? Well, they issued a statement, right? Anyone misappropriating or expropriating Microsoft's proprietary software technology will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Just what you would expect, like a music company, right? What happened then? Limor Fried doubled the reward to $2,000. So in 48 hours, there was a driver published. And in 2 weeks, there was this fabulous website called Kinect Hacks, and it had people using the Kinect to capture choreography and new ways to look at medical x-rays and wonderful games for kids and all of this beautiful panoply of invention that used this great invention called Kinect. And here's the surprise. Microsoft did not file charges. Somebody at Microsoft said, maybe we could sell more of these things if we let more people use them. Amazing, right? And so they said, go to it, guys. And now they're selling Kinects in all kinds of applications, and they even learned for themselves that Kinect could be an interface for the next for the next generation of Windows, and have announced that they will use it that way. So not quite open innovation, but an invisible handshake, allocating resources where people see uses for them and finding a commercial way to benefit from it. And this is a frontier of business model innovation. So now, we've got, in the first two rules, people paying attention to dimensions of value that are, we might call, social dimensions. They're valuing what happens to stakeholders other than shareholders. And then we're seeing collaboration replace pseudo-competition. Doesn't mean there isn't competition to innovate, iOS and Android, for example. It means there isn't pseudo-competition based on pure share of voice that misallocates resources in a way that doesn't lead to the optimal pricing in a market. Well, that's beginning to sound like NGOs, isn't it? People who pay attention to social variables, not profit-driven, and sharing things willy-nilly rather than claiming them for proprietary use. But we've said corporations are moving this direction. And so here's a way to think about what's happening. Let's think of two dimensions of an enterprise. One is its income earned in the market, or is it contributed socially? And second, for whose benefit? Of the owners or the society? So if we think of corporations, they earn income for owner benefit, classically, and NGOs and public sector are taxing or getting contributed income for social benefit. And in that lower left corner, why is that empty? That's getting a trust fund, right? But what's happening is that businesses, as we've talked about in externalities, are moving to include social benefit and social beneficiaries in their decision-making criteria. And in the NGO public sector, there is a movement toward more accountability and a blend of contributed and market income. And that blend is what I'm calling the fourth sector. And let me give you a couple of examples. This is Sweta Mangal. She used to work for United Technologies in Connecticut, and she was bored because there wasn't enough traffic, so she went back to Mumbai and founded an ambulance service. Now, nobody would lend her money to buy ambulances because nobody had ever made money with an ambulance service because there wasn't any ambulance service. So the bankers were not interested in being either risk capital VCs or patient capital philanthropies. So what she did was to create a hybrid organization. It started with a foundation which could accept patient capital donations to buy ambulances. And then she had an operating company, it's called Dial 1298 for Ambulance, that would lease the ambulances from the foundation at what would be a reasonable market rate if you could borrow at a reasonable rate of interest. So she had all of the discipline of making a profit and paying the full costs of her inputs, but she had the benefit of patient capital being put into the foundation to overcome the unwillingness to take the risk that the bankers had. So this kind of hybrid is just one example. There are dozens taking shape. And a guy who used to run the Acumen Fund, venture philanthropists, for India has now started a business raising funds only to invest in these kinds of hybrids. Now here's a pure corporate example. Natura, Cosméticos Natura, is the largest employer in Latin America. They employ 1 million people. And they are an Avon kind of a business. They sell through local women holding gatherings and selling to friends, right? About a third of these women depart every year. Now, an American company might say, this is a leakage of value. We're training people. In most cases, these are women who have never had a paying job. And we're training them to work, to keep books, we're upgrading their skills and their employability, and they're leaving us after roughly 3 years. We should do something. We should put funds in escrow that they have to earn back, or we should reduce our cost of training or something, because this is too expensive. What Natura says is, this is part of our output. This is part of what we produce for the societies in which we do business, the improvement of the labor force. And so this is our success, not our failure, in addition to selling our cosmetics. So an externality-based idea of what they're actually producing. And they also have, I should say, about the most elaborate and operational triple bottom line accounting system that I've seen. And in a strategy study, so a consultant summed up what they were saying, and they say, so you're saying in the future we need to find a way to grow while maintaining our commitment to social values. And the CFO, important, the CFO said, no, we need to figure out how to grow by maintaining our social values. And that is an incarnation of this point of view that can take hold. And I know it wouldn't be politic to stress Unilever too much, but this is the kind of talk that you hear from Paul Pullman these days as well. And the whole conscious capitalism movement is going in this direction. Okay. So Ian Bremmer said it's a search for new models. We've described a couple. Social impact. There's a whole list here. It includes hybrid structures and corporate responsibility. Not going to talk through this list. What I want to say is once you start looking, you'll find a whole bunch of experiments out there looking for new models. So the last thing I want to talk about is why this might not happen. This is a very nice system, isn't it? That we say evolutionary forces are going to overcome these weaknesses of capitalism. And in the presence of some kind of white space in the emerging economies, capitalism will evolve in a way that's much more prosperous as far as societies are concerned, and actually from a pure economics point of view, allocates resources better. It's a great story. And I actually believe in it, but I want to show you the counter scenario and where the enemy lies. There is the enemy. In biology, there is something called the peacock effect. Why does the peacock have this tail? Anybody want to guess? Yeah? Bingo. Thank you. This is what Mick and I were studying at Santa Fe, right? Positive feedback loops, that the peahens only want males with bigger, brighter tails. So you get males with bigger, brighter tails because everybody else is, still stuck at their game console. And so peahens don't want smart peacocks. They don't want funny peacocks. They don't even want peacocks with Ferraris. They want peacocks with big tails. So it gets bigger and bigger. The problem is they get slower and slower. So when the honey badger is unleashed, they can't run away. They're subject to predation. And it's expensive. Evolutionarily, you got to eat a lot to build this thing and maintain it. So there are fewer peacocks as a result. The species is disadvantaged by this runaway effect, and thank you for explicating that. What do we see here? We hear Jamie Dimon calling the Volcker rule unnecessary. Now, why would he do that? Did he like the recession? Did he like banks being quasi-nationalized? No. But he has become, and I'm not blaming him individually, he is part of the system that reinforces big tails, big ROEs, growth of ROE and profit. He has been designed to do that. Right? And so the choice for capitalism is peahens or finches. Are we going to adapt, or are we stuck in an evolutionary runaway that's eventually going to get us eaten by predators? And I want to put a stark choice in front of you that's quite operational today as an example of how this battle gets fought. Because remember I said it's not coming down from Davos. It's how companies and individuals make decisions. So here's one. Chinese and Indian drug makers are on the verge of selling cheaper copies of such huge sellers as Herceptin. Right, so this is another leap forward in capability compared to generic small molecule drugs. So this is a good thing, right? A lot of women need Herceptin in the emerging economies who can't afford it today. This is New York Times talking. Their entry could ignite a counterattack by major pharmaceutical companies and diplomats from richer countries. Just like music producers, right? We want to sue our users for like saving their lives. How does this end? Any PR people in the room? Probably. You know, how do you like the counterattack? How does that play? I mean, I think it's hard to spin it, isn't it? Well, we're not going to make more drugs like Herceptin if you use them. There is no evidence for this, by the way, in academic literature. So we are going to evolve some different business model, not that allows people to steal intellectual property, but that also doesn't allow the restriction of it where it could be useful. And I want to. Do I have another minute, Mick? 1 minute. Okay. People like to say in China, when they start becoming the source of intellectual property, they're going to stop stealing it because they see that their bread is buttered on the side of charging like other monopolists do. I don't think so. I think if you were developing an economy for the future, and I came to you and I said, I have this fairy dust, and I sprinkle this fairy dust all over your economy, and the economy grows twice as fast. And wait, there's more. It's free. Would you start out by writing into your economic rule set, we're going to restrict the use of fairy dust? It would not be a sensible thing to do, but that's what knowledge is. That's what the sharing of knowledge is. And so the other trend we will see moving forward in capitalism is the reaction to the fact that knowledge is not a zero-sum game the way a bar of steel is. And that in order to take advantage, in order for the world to take advantage of all of our new intellectual and information tools, we have to find a regime where information becomes a much more widely shared good. And the assumption is that things become public domain and or licensable in some fair way. And IBM is a leader in this, having put millions of patents out there for easy licensing. And speaking of the fourth sector, let's look at Harvard and Stanford and MIT putting courseware out there for people to use in a similar fashion. So this fourth sector is a very knowledge-intensive place, a very sharing-intensive place, and it makes it incumbent on leading companies to learn how to operate in this very free state. And so the other choice, one of the choices for capitalism is knowledge a zero-sum proprietary good, or is it something that is a source of value for the society that we learn how to benefit from, as do others? So it's not the destruction of capitalism, it's its evolution, and capitalism is an adaptive system. And one of the ways it adapts is by getting rid of those who don't adapt. If you've got the wrong-shaped beak, you're not going to get fed. Or as Jack Welch put it, when the rate of change outside exceeds the rate of change inside, the end is in sight. Mick, thank you.